So people are asking me why there are continuing to be large layoffs in tech. Here we are, nearly September in 2024, and we're still seeing giant tech companies lay off thousands of people. And the problem with this is that they don't understand. Maybe they haven't seen my other videos on Section 174. Maybe they haven't seen my other videos where I describe the relationship between Section 174 and the high interest rates, which are making companies have to cannibalize themselves and effectively fire their best people so they can keep existing because of the predatory tax structure that they don't have to worry about. But there's also the fact that when you really get down to it, there's external forces that are part of the greater economy at work as well. Part of that is inflation. And so if I were to go in and I were to say, let's see here, taxes, high interest rates, and I think I got as far as inflation. And so these are the big things that you should be considering. Now, in my other prior videos, I've talked about Section 174 and high interest rates. Go watch those videos if you want to understand how that's happening, because that is the greater impetus. Normally, inflation is not a problem, but it is here. Because what's happening is that those taxes and the high interest rates on loans are now being compounded by inflation and high inflation because of massive government spending around COVID and everything else. And so we had though everybody got some money in their bank account or whatever, and companies would literally start new ventures just so they could get that income and then funnel it into their main accounts, which I personally consider to be a form of fraud, but let's not go there because I don't want to make this video about that. And so the end result is that you had a lot of spending because of COVID. Now, some of that spending was good. Some of it just was dumb. And what that did was devalue the American dollar. That's why you see other sovereign currencies, having different valuations, and that's why the forex market was so interesting for a little while there. There was an active problem because of inflation, and it's becoming less and less of a thing because of the new policies that were in place to combat it. But part of that as well is that's right, layoffs. Layoffs combat inflation. You see, when inflation is high, money becomes less valuable. In order to make it more valuable, you got to lay people off because suddenly nobody has money anymore and everybody wants it. That's how that works. And so what happens is you get reduced spending from the consumer class, which in turn makes the money more valuable, and you also have more slop when it comes to companies hiring. They can offer lower rates because now that money is worth more versus before they were paying a higher rate. And so, what you're seeing with inflation and the layoffs is them intentionally trying to manipulate the market in order to assure that they can fight the inflation, but also so they can offer lower wages. And so, if you're talking about the general part of, this right here, I've made other videos on that. But inflation is interesting because what happens here is that this requires that they lay people off. Inflation requires that they hire new people at lower wages. And so the issue there is that the tech market has not historically done well with low wages. There are many reasons for this, but actively at the end of the day, what it comes down to is in order to be able to be a good programmer and to be able to output good quality work, you have to have psychological safety. And if I'm going to translate that term, basically what it comes down to is you have to feel safe. You have to have money in the bank. You got to have food on your table. You got to have a little bit of excess so you can unwind when you're off of work. To be a good software development engineer requires that you get paid more or at least paid enough. And unfortunately, it's very common in America, at least, that we don't get paid enough to live. There are people with multiple jobs who literally can't make rent. And that's not just inflation. That is the economic system that we live in as Americans. And so, one of the things that I need to call out here is that a large part of my audience wants to get into software simply because they want to make a lot of money. That is the worst way of thinking about it possible. I think it's actually better to want to be an engineer and to want to build a good engineered life. But at the same time, I recognize that people are going to do what they're going to do because they think that it's going to get them money. The problem is, there's a lot of people who are flat out lying to junior engineers and telling them that they're going to make millions of dollars or they're going to make hundreds of thousands of dollars in their first year as a junior software development engineer. To be honest, most juniors don't make even 100 grand. They don't even make 90 grand in many cases. And so the big issue there is that you're being lied to if you think you're going to make that money. And even now, with things going down, you're probably not going to make that in your lifetime anyway. And so, if you're going into technology to make money, find something else because that's not going to happen for you. You're not good enough. You'll never be good enough. And you're going to be competing with everybody that I talked about in my prior videos, especially if you're a junior with no experience who is competing with people who have experience who are junior, as well as that giant wave of mid-level engineers that are going to be forced to age out of the system and then just not get hired at some point because they refuse to work on themselves and get better. And so when you look at this particular thing, you have effectively two large camps here, crowds of people. You have the S164 taxes, which are making it so you can make $1 million, spend $1 million, and now have to pay taxes on $1 million in addition to not having any money. Then you have the fact that when you try to get a loan to pay the IRS, because not paying the IRS is not an option, you have to pay the IRS. And to do that, most companies get loans. Now you're going to pay more interest on those loans, which means it's going to cost you more money to pay your legally obligated taxes. And then the inflation says, well, we have to, there's money's worth less. How do we do that? Well, the market is still paying great rates. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to fire everybody and we're going to collude as an industry illegally, and we are going to violate RICO laws, and we are going to have somebody go onto every single area and just claim that it's about spending and budgeting in the future because we don't know, while at the same time getting our best years possible. And if you look at the K2s for the publicly traded companies that are laying people off, you will see that they are making the best, most profitable years of their existence at the same time they're laying off people. And that's for two things. If that is the fact that they're laying off people so they can deal with the taxes and not have to worry about going into their normal profits for paying those taxes. Because let's face it, they're wildly popular, they're wildly profitable. They have the money to pay those taxes. They just don't want to. Even with the alternative minimum tax that some of them have to pay now, they don't want to. They want the numbers to stay the same because they're publicly traded companies and they actively don't want their margins to be harmed because that lowers their stock price, which in turn is a vicious cycle that allows them and their competitors to buy them out cheaper, which is something they don't want because that leads to something called a hostile takeover. And at that point, their competition buys them and they don't have the right to say no. And so these things are all tied together. It's a very complex system. But inflation, one of the ways that they fight inflation is to fire everybody. Because at that point, well, money's a lot more valuable when you don't have a job. And that is an intentional thing. Okay? It is not about, it is not just about, look, we need to fire everybody in to be able to deal with the taxes and everything else. A lot of these companies, yes, they're firing people because they have these sudden taxes and they don't know how to make payroll because they're not making enough profit. And then they try to go out and they try to find a way to get a loan so they can pay those taxes because they're legally required to pay the taxes. Not paying those taxes is not an option for them. And then they can't, and they go, well, maybe we just need to trim the fat and tighten their belt a little bit. And they do that, and they look at their costs. They go, wow, we spend most of our stuff on people. Well, if we get rid of some super senior people, maybe we can do it. And that's why some really great people have been fired. It has nothing to do with their ability. It has nothing to do with them being bad. It has to do with the fact that the company just thought to themselves, we'll be able to hire them later because they're such a rare resource that we're going to put them in a position so that they will come back to us later. That is their thinking. It is an intentional manipulation tactic. And then you get this fact that by doing that, by firing those people, you're making money more valuable to them. And you're intentionally fighting inflation that way because you're taking the most senior people who had the most access and the most ability, and you're making money scarce for them, which in turn promotes the idea that money is scarce for everybody below them. And if you're thinking, what, Duane, aren't you contributing to this by making these videos? Yes, I am. But at the same time, there's also the idea that if I look at the data as I've done, and we talk about the SDE2 and SDE wave, that all fits and actually helps you to know about this. So that's my goal. Because if you're aware of these things, you'll be able to help navigate them better by either going to a different industry or, simply opting out altogether. That's up to you. But the end result is that you will actively need to think about inflation and not just Section 174, not just the high interest rates. Because inflation will also lead layoffs. Because you've got this idea okay? And you're going to have to deal with the fact that from a purely how do we deal with this perspective? You've got two reasons to do layoffs. Companies have the taxes, the high interest rates, you've got the inflation. That's happening. But here's the problem. When layoffs happen too much, and we've seen this a lot already, we're actually seeing a lot of companies in the market, especially tech companies, they don't have the people they need to work. And there are some companies that try to claim that they just run lean, et cetera, et cetera. But in reality, they've got technical debt and they're slowly dying. This is something that's well known in the industry. And that was one of the reasons why a lot of people were trying to use AI to deal with technical debt. And that just created more technical debt because, as anybody who's worked on an LLM knows, if you don't closely audit the code that an LLM gives you, you're going to be in for a bad time. The end result is that if you consider this as a layoffs, what happens is to those people? What happens with those people and where do they go when they're not working? Well, that technical ability is now removed from the people who are working, right? It's now in what's called the labor pool, right? And so the labor pool goes in and says, well, what how do I actually what do I do now? Like what is my actual thing? I've got to live somewhere. I've got to do something. Sometimes these people go into different industries. Sometimes they get out of tech entirely. Sometimes they go do startups. And so there's a cycle here where now you're going to do smaller companies, startups, and small business. And so the issue here is that if you actively follow this, not everybody's going to be able to do this. Okay. Not everybody has the money to do a startup. Okay. But what it does do is it increases interest in them. And so you've got this idea where you've got people who are now they've been laid off, they're now looking for new work, and they've actually gone out of their way to say, okay, well, what now? Do I want to stay in the industry? Maybe I want to try something different. Maybe I just want to rest and rejuvenate. Maybe I've got some savings. Okay. Then you got other people who are running to the next job because they were living paycheck to paycheck before, which is actually a big thing in tech. A lot of people they'll tell you, oh well, you're not making as much money as you think you are, uh, and that's true. If you have the bad idea that working in tech means that you are just saving money left and right, yeah, you can, but the fact is you're going to run out of money eventually anyway, and a lot of people do what they can to there's a lot of middlemen in tech. And so if you're working contracts, for example, you're not getting paid a market wage. A lot of the people who talk about getting large amounts of money are getting it from stock grants, and those typically try not to pay out. It's actually really hard to get those. And if you're one of those people who's getting stock grants, it's because you have leadership that actually cares and protected you because the people above you tried to take that away from you. It's something that's actively it's a problem in the tech industry. And so don't believe that everybody in tech makes good money or suddenly has money to live on if they're suddenly not working because that's not true either. And so the end result is that layoffs happen. People spend their money, they go into the labor pool, they either go back to work for a different company or they do a startup. And then, well, you know what? They live their life. They live their life. And at that point, they're living their life, they're working, they're doing whatever, life and work. And so the fun thing about this, and the one thing I want to call out, is that there is a liminal space between all of these. Okay? If you are actively in a situation where you are, you're in one job, you're living that life, and then you change jobs, you very, very much end up having this change of life. Your life changes because of your job. Okay? It changes because of how much you make. It changes because of how much you're getting, what your commute is like every day. These things impact your life in a big way. And that is why people wanting to go to remote jobs is such a big deal because they save time. They have a different life because of it. And so in each of these liminal spaces, or rather in these arrows that I've drawn, the fact is you are experiencing a life transition. Okay. And so working for that company pre-pandemic versus working for a different startup after the pandemic is a very different experience, isn't it? And so as a result of that, you are going to have a different perception of the world around you and a different perception of money. And so what it comes down to is because of this new perception of life, because of this new perception of everything, you are going to be kind of just dealing with this either way. The problem is that right now you are as a software development engineer always going to have to deal with section 174 until it expires. Yes, it expires. You see, the section 174 was actually a 5-year thing. And so it went into effect 2022. It is supposed to expire in 2026, I think. I'm going to have to double check that. Um, and if it doesn't get extended, then this will break. And what will happen is we're going to get a massive spike in the people who hire because this will no longer be a problem anymore. We no longer will have to deal with any of this. And so that would be a good thing. At that point, the reverse of this will happen. We'll be able to go in and we'll be able to say, oh, well, okay, let's just figure it out. Maybe we can do, maybe instead of layoffs and everything else, we can do, oh, let's see here. let's see. They're going to be hiring more. So instead of layoffs, they're going to do what? Wrong one. So let's just say that instead of layoffs, they're going to do hiring. Okay, they're going to do more hiring because those are going or these are going to be gone, right? So you're going to be in a situation where there is absolutely no. Let's just do it this way because I want to make sure I can actually make that clear here. Yeah. And then so the big thing here is that you want to be in a situation where because of this hiring, because of the things that are going on here, you you're going to have more opportunity. Okay? There's going to be more problem, not less problems because there's to be more hiring. That will deal with the inflation in a different way. You're going to be in a situation where suddenly money is valuable for a different reason because companies want it in order to hire more. And there's going to be better life work balance. People like you and me, SDEs, can then have that bargaining power again. And because of that, I honestly suspect that the Tax Job Cuts and Jobs Act will get extended. I believe that Section 174 was probably here to stay, and I hate to say it, I don't think it's going away. The important thing to understand here is that too many people actively benefit from this cycle, from having the ability to say, okay, because of high taxes and interest, there's going to be layoffs, because that inflation reduction impacts everybody outside of tech. Effectively, tech is being sacrificed to allow inflation to be reduced for everybody else. Software development engineers are being harmed so that a hairdresser or a tree trimmer can have a better life because there's a lot more of them. I'll quote Spock here and say the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And so when this is broken, that hiring will come again and the impact on inflation will lessen. We will actually, that will turn that spigot off and the rest of the economy will do its thing in order to manage inflation appropriately through quantitative easing and other mechanisms. The big thing about this, though, is that when that happens, you will have a very different life than what you have now. There will be in many ways, how can I say this? It will be like it was a couple years ago in a better way. But we're still going to have to see what happens because, unfortunately, one of the big problems with the current situation is that people who own companies like this situation. Okay. It puts them in a better negotiating path. It allows them to have power during wage negotiations. It allows them to go out, do their own thing, and when they want to, hire. But it also limits them in their ability to grow their business because they can't hire like they used to be able to when it comes to wanting to get things done. The end result of that is that right now, because of the right side of this screen, with high interest rates, inflation's creating layoffs, labor pool, that also means that there's going to be less engineering capacity. And so when you get down to this, companies will have more engineering capacity. And so engineering capacity is a good thing. It allows companies to grow. It allows them to get the work done. It allows them to churn through those JIRA tickets as fast as possible and actually create things that customers want faster. It's good for growth. It's good for companies that want to get off the ground. It's good for startups. It's good for anything that the basic value engine that has historically created innovation. But it's terrible for the people who don't want to be competed with. Okay. And so, one of the things that you should understand about all of this is that Section 174 was created to stop competition. It was created to slow down the technical markets and technical innovation in America. It was created to artificially depress technology innovation and create layoffs to create a anti-inflationary pressure, but also to make it so that the status quo would be easier for the people who are currently in power. Because if you look at the right side of the screen here, layoffs, inflation, a larger labor pool of people looking for work, maybe people wanting to do startups or whatever, or people willing to look at smaller companies with lower pay in order to just survive. What that does is it stops those people from being able to go out and innovate and actively work for the same companies and actively give them the engineering capacity they need to keep churning through Jira tickets as fast as possible. It allows the status quo to stay the same. And that is what Trump wanted when he did that, is my opinion. And so, because you have to understand the history of this, Section 174 happened after people dunked on Trump on Twitter. It happened after people used their tech abilities to kind of call him out as a fraud and use their data abilities to be able to prove things that he said were untrue. That's why he did it. It was retribution. It was an explicit attempt to retaliate against the tech industry. And then the tech industry realized, oh, well, you know what? If I'm having to lay off people and I can't go as fast and I don't have as much engineering capacity because I have to do layoffs, then you know what? Let's just make it bad for everybody. And that's what happened. That's what's happening now. And once people started doing it, the weaker leaders, the people in tech who actually shouldn't be in tech, but are just trying to get their KPIs matching and making their boss happy, started doing layoffs as well. Not because they needed to, but because they wanted to be in. They had a fear of missing out. So they wanted to lay off people so they could be cool too. And so there's a 5 year situation where this is, it's 5 years. 5 years was the situation for Section 174. If it expires and it doesn't get added, this will break. This chain will break. The left half of the screen will start to happen. Engineering capacity will ship into high gear. Life and work will get better for us developers. And we might even churn through the wave of mid tier SDE2s writing mid code who are blocking the people who are juniors from getting the jobs they want. But the damage will have been done. At that point, there'll have been too many people, and the inflationary layoff, labor pool, all that fun stuff will have already happened. And so wages will have to go down, at least in the near term. And unfortunately, I think the big mark of innovation and the companies that will innovate the most are the ones that will innovate the most money to payroll. If you are looking for a way to differentiate your company and a way to out innovate and outperform everybody else, hire and hire at high rates. It's that simple because it's the same playbook that the FANG companies used to get big. They hired people and they paid them a lot of money to motivate them. And it worked. It fully worked.